All right, so I'm so happy to be welcoming the editor-in-chief of the polling firm Gallup, Mohamed Younis. For over a decade, he has been leading some of Gallup's largest global and regional studies. So he's been involved in their polling abroad as well as analysis domestically. He's involved in some of their newest initiatives as far as analytics. Mohamed, I took a poll, albeit an unscientific one, among this community, and they wanted to hear from someone in polling. So here we are.
Here we are, and coincidentally, another Mo on the scene. So this is officially the first time I'm being interviewed by somebody who also goes by Mo.
I was going to say, and I think this is the first Mo we've had as a guest on the Mo News podcast. So Mo squared.
Mo squared, exactly.
I think if this goes well, there might be a show for us.
Hey, man, the pressure's all on me, obviously.
So in the lead up to this, Mo has been sending me a whole bunch of polling that Gallup has done. So we'll take sort of a pulse of America on a few different topics. We've also discovered as we were talking in advance, we have a number of things in common, including family and growing up both in the U.S. and in the Middle East. So we may get to that. Mo, also as we speak, this is a big week in presidential politics. So we'll get to all things 2024. But, Gallup is involved in so much more than that. And when we were speaking briefly in advance, you were talking about this firm founded nearly 90 years ago, becoming a way for leaders to understand the voice of the people. The reason why I love having you and Gallup and people who follow this podcast, follow what we're doing on Instagram, know that you often see Gallup polling. It's considered a gold standard when it comes to polling. It was a go-to during my time in network news. It gives you a sense of really what's happening here at home and globally. But I want to begin there with kind of big picture, Mohamed, the role of Gallup, what Gallup does, and a bit of the history.
In the 1930s, there was a gentleman named George Gallup, and his passion was really statistics and sampling. He wanted to figure out a way to ask a smaller number of people a question and be able to project it to the larger population. He was a social researcher. He was a journalist. He was obsessed with the fact that leaders seem to be having a conversation. It's so fascinating. We're talking about this, and the debt ceiling is happening down the street. That leaders were having conversations about policy that didn't really involve public opinion in a scientific, reliable way. The man on the street, the woman on the street, their voice, the way they were living their lives, the challenges they faced, he felt were not being adequately considered and reported on to those who are making decisions. So he set out to find a way to really prove his sampling method worked. And he believed it worked, but he was really on a search for how can I gather folks around me and get the community, the public, to really confirm this. And he used presidential elections with that dichotomous outcome, often between two options here in the U.S., as the testing ground really to do that. And at the time, his first forecast of elections really grounded him as being the best at the time, the most accurate at the time. There were a lot of organizations trying to forecast elections. They were primarily based on magazines with subscribers and asking those subscribers who they plan to vote for. Of course, you know this, Mo, and your audience knows this. That's a really cool way to get interesting information. In terms of how representative that is, it's not going to be very helpful if you're trying to go beyond subscribers to that magazine.
Right. If you're trying to get a gauge, take a pulse of America, you're already taking a subset of a population if you're only looking at subscribers of a certain publication.
Exactly. So he really was able to crack the code on that and became famous for forecasting these outcomes. He was extremely successful. In our 90-plus year history, we've only really came out to the wrong forecast twice to get away. And I'd love to talk to you also about our last foray into that and why we decided that forecasting presidential outcomes wasn't really where we wanted to spend our next 90 years. But really going back to George Gallup, he really used that as a platform. He was very successful at that, but all of his speeches, which are all documented, it's fascinating to read what he was saying back in the 40s and 50s and 70s. His passion was about reporting on the will of the people. And one of his sort of most famous quotes, his epigraph, if you will, was, if democracy is about the will of the people, somebody should go out and find what that will is. And that was really his life's mission. It continues to be our mission today at Gallup. In the 1980s, Dr. Gallup passed away. But before he did, he was very intent on conveying sort of this responsibility and mission to an organization that could carry forth that purpose. And around the 1980s, a survey research organization from the Midwest ended up acquiring Gallup. And Dr. Gallup's two sons actually were heavily involved in the rest of Gallup all the way through the 90s, and were some of the most prolific social scientists we had in the company. So today, Gallup is an employee-owned consulting firm that uses data, public opinion research, all kinds of data to try to understand how society is changing and who can best benefit from getting insight, empirical-based insight on that change. So whether that's, working from home and hybrid work and why people love it and why it's, changing the way we live, to who Americans think is the greatest enemy of the United States, to, tracking 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations and the international community. We're now using public opinion data and really data science at a larger level to try to understand, how can you bring numbers, how can you quantify how a life is lived accurately in a reliable way, and in a way that isn't pushing for an agenda, isn't funded by a interest group, isn't necessarily doing it for one party or the other. That was a really big part of his mission is, if you want to be taken seriously as an objective source of information, you kind of have to walk the walk in addition.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something really important for people to keep in mind. Not all polls are equal scientifically. Not all polls are equal in terms of agenda or lack of agenda. And we've entered an era, I mean, even as I've been covering presidential politics the past 20 years, where there's just more and more partisan polling firms, and they'll put out their numbers and they'll get picked up in the media, and the media might not necessarily characterize them as, some reporters don't know the difference, and they'll just be like, oh, there's this poll out there. Well, that's a poll by a Republican firm or by a firm paid for by a certain candidate that wants to showcase a certain agenda.
Absolutely.
And it's not hard to manipulate the data. So, Mo, you mentioned there were 2 presidential elections in history that Gallup got wrong. One in our lifetime, the Obama-Romney one. And then what was the previous one?
The other one was 1948. It was Harry S. Truman's showdown with Thomas Dewey. And of course, you remember, Mo, the big headlines that Dewey was going to win.
It was the headline the next morning. It was the morning that we figured out Truman won, and the newspapers went to print the night before, seeing the numbers and based on the previous polls that Dewey was going to be the next president.
And what's what's really fascinating about that is, back in 1948, the story then was, this is the end of polling. You can't trust the polls. And here we are in 2023, and we're still really grappling with that, as we discussed earlier. The Obama-Romney one I bring up because it was actually a really critical moment in exactly what you're talking about. Can we trust polls? Do polls really represent what the public will is showing us, or telling us? And can we really guess how people are going to vote? The answer really is, yeah, we can. It's just getting harder and harder to do so, primarily because of human behavior, primarily because of trying to build a likely voter model in an environment where voters are voting in very different ways than they used to before. Different people who don't usually vote traditionally, historically, are getting more involved in the process. So there are really structural reasons why it's really hard, but you can still do it. The reason we stepped away from it really was, and it's fascinating, Mo, that you were in the industry exactly at the time when this started happening, where there was a shift from a few really reliable organizations that really kind of held each other accountable on methodology and what was a responsible way to report public opinion, fading into an era where a lot of aggregators of polls really became very established and followed.
Yeah, so there's a few of these. There's Politics 538. There's Real Clear Politics. There's a few that put together averages of many.
And
polls.
what we ended up with collectively, really, in this space is an environment where we're putting together apples and oranges. We're averaging polls together that were captured differently, using different methodologies, representing different populations of the American public. And we were kind of, making a little smoothie and saying, this is the prediction based on my modeling. It became very hard, really, much more complicated to take apart how is that modeling generated? What are the factors that you've put into it as a researcher? What are the variables you're relying on? How consistent are the data points you're actually comparing? What are the time periods of when you're asking people these questions? It really did kind of spread very thin over a lot of really critical statistical rigor that was relied upon in this space, in just forecasting elections and the news around it. So we ended up in a place where the loudest voices really prevailed. It also obviously happened at a time when news content and how news was delivered and the kind of news that succeeds with viewers really changed as well, where we kind of entered this clickbait era, sensational headlines.
And we're talking about a 24-hour news cycle really heating up, and you just got to feed the beast, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And you enter the social media era where everything just goes up on Twitter immediately. And that's where all the journalists live. And so then that'll dictate their storylines. And so it's all this cycle that feeds itself.
What was really fascinating to me, Mo, is like, you are super in the know. And when we talked on the phone, you were like, yeah, I remember the Gallup daily tracking poll. And absolutely, like, it for about 6 years, we were tracking daily what Americans thought. We were polling over 1,000 Americans every single day. It was, as a researcher, it was absolutely awesome to have so much data.
Yeah, so we were waking up every morning in journalism. I checked the daily tracking poll. I was like, oh, Romney's up 1 point. Oh, Obama's down 1 point, et cetera. This went over a few cycles.
And one of the things we really learned through that process is, outside of that lead up right to the election, not a lot was changing in the daily tracking poll. It was a lot of slow change over time. And it was a really important, that coupled really with the environment that was happening in forecast and polling, we really had a lot of soul searching to come back to, what is our mission as an organization? How do we continue to deliver on being the source for people to come to, that's not biased, can be trusted, is transparent about what people think? And it really didn't seem like the space where we could add value anymore. And what's fascinating to me is to watch so many other organizations now really follow in that path, where highly respected, established organizations are realizing, I can add so much more value, whether it's news or public opinion or whatever, outside of this immediate sort of hysteria-driven partisan news cycle. We see it happening now with the debt ceiling and the coverage around it. It's really fascinating to see how there's a stream of content that's really about personalities and what they said last. And then there's a stream of news content and reporting that's really about, what's this going to mean for industries, for individuals. And I think all around us now, no matter what your trade is, no matter what content you're creating, we're all challenged with this. More is not more. And sometimes breaking things down and providing less that's more succinct and focused is better. And that's really where we've been trying to move to.
And just to put a button on 2012, so your final tracking poll, at least based on my research, was 49-48, Romney with the edge over Obama. The results of the actual election, though, on election night in the aftermath, was Obama winning by about 4%, 51-47, and dominating the electoral vote that night.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating also about that is, after that, what we did is we created a blue ribbon commission where we gathered basically everybody who was contributing at the top level to the polling industry, whether you are a journalist or a statistician, a researcher, our friends at Pew, our friends at NORC. We brought everybody together and really had a study session that was multiple, volumes long. We tried to understand why that happened and produced a report, and in detail drew out why the outcome came to be that way and what we could have changed for it not to be that way. But of course, Mo, what's fascinating is nobody covered that other than the data nerds, who I love dearly. But really, for the news cycle and for the public, it's like, polls are wrong. The polls were wrong. Yeah. And that narrative has stayed with us until today. Even
and that's been reinforced.
They haven't been wrong.
That's been reinforced by several cycles now.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And I'd love to, we talked about this earlier. I'd love to unpack that too. Like, are the polls wrong? It depends on which polls, right? It really depends on what you're talking about. I'm a huge, I don't know you well enough yet, Mo, but I'm a huge music fan. I'm a huge Wu-Tang fan. And one of the things the RZA used to always say was, you got to read the label. And you do. You really have to look behind the product and look into how was this information gathered? Who does it represent? And only then can you begin to say, can I trust the polls? What's been happening is a lot of us have been consuming news media that will cover one-off or two or three state polls and really
Right.
create a narrative in the news cycle that the Republicans are going to take over, the Democrats, the red wave. We're all waiting for the red wave. And in reality, politics is super local in this country. And if you're drawing national conclusions from not so representative state polls, absolutely you're going to conclude that the polls weren't accurate. But in terms of national polls and in terms of RDD phone polling, it's pretty well established for those of us who have looked into it that actually they are pretty accurate. And they have been across the board, whether it's in presidential elections or in midterm elections. Now, using those polls, right? And when I say accurate, what do I mean? I essentially mean that are the data similar to what actually happened among people who voted?
So it's hard to separate presidential politics from the economy. There's a famous Clinton advisor, James Carville, who you'll still see on TV, who had the old bumper sticker adage, "It's the economy, stupid." That was his strategy for Bill Clinton in the early 90s, coming out of that recession, and helping to get him reelected. Gallup spends a lot of time trying to get a sense of financial hardship, the economy, how people feel about it, especially in light of inflation recently.
Absolutely. One of the ways we do it monthly is we have an economic confidence index where we ask people about the economy today and where they see it going. But inflation has really been where a lot of our data have been most telling. Today, nearly half of Americans describe that in some way they're experiencing hardship because of inflation, high cost of living, paying rent and mortgage. So the cost of living is definitely still a major factor. And what's really interesting is that despite the finance news cycle, kind of taking a sigh of relief with the central bank slowing down interest rate hikes, in terms of Main Street, people are still really feeling that pain. We also find that this bank scare has taken a toll on people's sense of the security of their own money. Half of Americans today say that they have some worry about the security of their deposits in banks, which is pretty fascinating to think about.
Talk about trust in institutions, right? We're talking about all these big institutions. The bank and whether they have my money is now something some people doubt.
And that's not just like a philosophical, issue. Also, what we find is that those numbers are very similar to where we were at the very bottom of the 2008 recession. So while the banking industry has certainly rebounded and is seeing record highs in some situations of profits, people's public trust in banks hasn't really improved since the Great Recession. And we still see that with us today. So worry about the security of people's money in banks, perceptions of opportunities for investment have really dramatically changed. Americans right now are at a record low in saying that now is a good time to buy a house. That trend goes all the way back to the mid-70s.
Right. I saw those numbers and then I'm like, wait, if you actually look at the market, you talk to brokers, Americans might be telling you that, Mo, but they're still out there buying.
Well, and I think that really speaks to two things, right? The perceptions and the reactions to mortgage rates really climbing up dramatically in a very short period of time. But at the other end of the scale, we're still living with this historic shortage of housing that we have from the 2008 recession. On the Gallup podcast, I had a great conversation with a financier that broke it all down for us. I mean, we basically had a period of time in this country where new houses were not being built. And that's not just houses, like housing, apartments, et cetera. And we haven't made up for that gap. So even though the mortgage rates are high, and if you're thinking about, is now a good time to go out and take a 30-year loan, and you're looking at what the rates were 2 years ago, that, those data make a lot of sense. But on the other hand,
so it's the inventory thing. It's that no matter what, no matter how few Americans think it's a good time to buy a home, there's still so little inventory available, it doesn't really matter.
Or it's probably still going to drive both dynamics at the same time. So people are going to be worried about interest rates, but you're still going to be able to sell if there's a record shortage and people can't find a place to live.
It's an important distinction, by the way. There's a poll and then there's forecasting. And I think a lot of the people are buying what the forecasters are saying, and the forecasters get it wrong, right? In the same way a weather forecaster gets it wrong when they're like, it's going to rain and it doesn't rain, or the opposite. And it's sort of how the political forecasters who are dominating the media landscape are doing their thing.
It's also happening at a time when trust in news in general is collapsing, right? So we've kind of laid out this whole horrible swirl of challenges as to why there's this narrative out there that polls aren't working or polls are broken. But at Gallup, every day we are processing, analyzing, and reporting on data from millions of interviews we're doing across the world. And so many of them, on so many levels, prove that polling is working. I mean, I know you, Mo, like me, you're an international affairs obsessed person because it was brought upon us, not because we were interested in it. But
because we had passports at a young age and went back and forth.
But one of the most fascinating things to me has been, polling the world and figuring out like what actually is useful to compare across countries, cultures, economies, languages, etc. One of the things we've discovered is life evaluation. How people evaluate their own lives is a very delicate and accurate thing if you do it properly. Why? Because it's fundamentally a relative assessment of what your life was like 5 years ago and what your life will be like in the next 5 years. That assessment works if you are, you can just imagine the international situations. You can be in Sweden and driving a Beamer and make that assessment. You can be in Cairo and, on a donkey in a cart selling fruit and make that assessment. It really is a universal thing. One of the things that really fascinated us as we looked back to things like the Arab uprisings, Donald Trump's election, the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, a lot of these global developments took place at a time when people's own life evaluation in those countries in our data was completely crashing. So it is super sexy and interesting to ask people like what they think about the debt ceiling, who's responsible for the debt ceiling. But what we've learned is that over time, what's actually much more prescient and really also intuitively useful as a social researcher that's trying to get ahead of the curve and understand what is the next big thing. Tracking how people evaluate their lives on all dimensions is actually proven to be one of the most useful and most accurate indicators of where things are going. And we can get into the countries in detail, but
I'd like to go global here for a second. We'll come back to things here in the States, presidential politics, etc. But Gallup is conducting polls. I think you told me 140 countries, 98% of the world's populations. Something you were heavily involved, that you're heavily involved in at Gallup. One thing we were talking about beforehand, and I'd love to start here actually, is you're talking about that you're doing polling in Afghanistan, and you're doing polling in countries where people don't generally feel free to share their opinion,
Absolutely.
especially if it's critical of the government. How do you do that? And I'm thinking of countries like Russia, like China, like the aforementioned Afghanistan. How does Gallup go about that?
We do it differently everywhere. So obviously, the local reality in the country determines a series of things. First of all, everything we're doing, we started this in 2005. Everything we do all over the world is done by local people in local languages. So they're survey research experts in country that we train on our methodology. They gather the data. We have a series of quality control checks. I mean, from the methodological side, all that's laid out and folks can read about that. But conceptually, like how can you ask people in Afghanistan how life's going?
How they feel about the Taliban.
Exactly. And the reality is, Mo, you don't ask questions that can't be answered honestly in that context. And part of our really what we've contributed to this space is building an institutional knowledge of years and years of testing questions in places, I hate to say places like in countries like Afghanistan, and in countries, like Sweden, of what does a person in this country think of when I say the word X? Does this concept really translate when I ask a question about why? I'll give you a really good example. At one point, we were really focused in the whole war on terror, Muslim world, Western world, debacle, clash of civilizations. We were really focused on perceptions of the West. And in Pakistan, what we discovered is that people actually thought you meant like the Western part of their region, not the West, the US.
Yeah.
Another really challenging question, and actually one we're reporting on soon, is we've just now hit the 50% plus mark on our global metric of people saying where I live is a good place to live for gay and lesbian people. But when you think about Afghanistan, you really can't ask that question in Afghanistan, because in some contexts in Afghanistan, that's actually asking people if a crime is being committed down the street from
Right.
them. So all of these contextual, very country specific nuances we take into account by working with people in country that understand what is and what is not possible. But one thing that has fascinated me is, we're talking about presidential approval earlier and US polling. One thing that is consistent across all of these countries, and really when I say these countries, I particularly mean the global South, poorer, less developed countries, is response rates are through the roof. They are absolutely through the roof. People want to say, want to talk to our interviewers. They want to express how they feel.
There's not a feeling that if they say that things are bad or things suck or they're hungry or the economy is bad, that there will be ramifications for them with the government?
It depends on how you ask the question. So if you want to ask about their own lives, in the vast
Yeah.
majority of places in the world, you don't go to jail for complaining that your life sucks. In a lot of restrictive environments.
So even in Afghanistan, people feel like I can say I'm hungry. I
Well,
can
I'll give you
say
an
things are
example.
bad.
One of the
Yeah.
questions we've released all these data at news.gallup.com. Check it out. It's one of our most important pieces.
Wait, say that website again?
News.gallup.com. It's where we release all of our own content. But a lot of this was picked up by so many other sources. I won't mention, but it really was one of the most important pieces of work we did this year, which is our work on Afghanistan and sharing what are kind of the top things that Afghan citizens have experienced or how have their perceptions changed since the Taliban have taken over. And we ask about whether women are treated with respect and dignity. And those data are pretty clear that people are answering honestly. We also ask about whether people want to leave their country permanently. And Afghanistan is one of the highest rates in the world of people that say they want to leave their country permanently.
So they feel comfortable saying that. And how do you poll women in Afghanistan about women's rights?
Yes. So in a lot of countries where there are a lot of gender restrictions around interaction, we do gender matching. So we'll have women interview women and men interview men. We also take extreme care to not interview respondents in an environment where there are other people in the room that could potentially, impact their response. So if we're doing a study on domestic violence, for example, even though we're not necessarily doing that in Afghanistan, we're not going to ask, one spouse about it in front of the other spouse. So there are all of these very thorough and rigorously tested techniques around every single survey we conduct, because the topic of the survey also determines what is sensitive and what is not sensitive and what you can and can't say in certain environments.
And based on the country, based on the technology in that country, is it a combination of in-person, written, mail, phone,
Absolutely.
online? Like
The way
how does it work country by country?
Our kind of general rule is, first of all, everything we do in country and the way we build our primary sampling units, if you will, is based on the most recent census data. So they're really aimed at being nationally representative samples of these countries. So we can really say this is what, people in Mali think. It's not just the cities. It's not just people who can speak a certain language, or et cetera. Everything's done in local languages. In a lot of countries, it means a lot of languages, which we do. We translate and back translate, et cetera. But a general rule is, if there's cell phone penetration in 80% of the country or more, we tend to do a phone poll. If there's not, we'll do an in-person, face-to-face poll. We also
Are people in other countries more willing to pick up random numbers than here in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, the U.S. and developed economies generally tend to have the lowest rate of people picking up random numbers. So yeah, I mean, to generalize, yes, but of course, every country is kind of different.
Staying global here, any other interesting trend lines you're seeing? The last number, the 50%, it's a good place to live number, struck my attention. Anything else that you're seeing that gives you a sense of how, if there's larger trend lines? I mean, it's hard to extrapolate just in America, but globally.
I love that.
Any other interesting trend lines?
Yeah, and I'm just grinning because it's amazing how people are like, "What are you learning across the world?" It's like, man, it's a lot of people. It's hard to generalize
Right.
across
You're
8
like,
billion lives.
well, if you live in Sudan right now or Ukraine, you have a very different view than living in Singapore.
Exactly. But fascinatingly enough, one of the mega trends really that we found in the world poll, and this is actually very detailed in a book we released recently called Blind Spot. And the blind spot really is the global rise of unhappiness. So, in a series of questions, we asked people if they've experienced positive or negative experiences in the day before the survey. Have you experienced a lot of worry, anger, sadness, happiness, joy, et cetera, et cetera? What we find globally is that there's been a rise in unhappiness really across the globe. And it's not because of COVID. Yes,
Unhappiness.
unhappiness. So whether it's anger, stress, worry, physical pain, all of those things have been on a steady increase, not only in particular regions of the world dramatically, but really at the global level, at the aggregate level. And Blind Spot's a really great place for those of you who are interested in megatrends and kind of what do you learn polling the world. It was a place where we wanted to bring together all of those mega findings. But I think the most prescient now and the most critical now is the global rise of unhappiness. In the US, we just dropped our record high in people who say they are experiencing depression or have been treated for depression. So the US is very consistent with the global trend, but it is a mega trend, not a great one to share, but one that's there for sure.
Yeah, according to those numbers, the percentage of U.S. adults who report having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime, 29%, nearly 1 in 3 Americans. That is 10 points higher than it was just about a decade ago. To what, though, do we attribute that to also just more openness culturally about talking about that? I was curious about that because, you guys do your best to poll when you try to come up with the underlying reasons as to why people feel that way. There sometimes are larger trends at play, right? Larger
Absolutely.
cultural things at play that could explain the numbers.
Absolutely. And I think, just mental health in general, that you were to talk about COVID, that is one of the things really that COVID changed. I mean, the more open nature, at least here in the US, around discussions of mental health and depression and anxiety, it has changed, and it probably is impacting the degree to which people are willing to admit or acknowledge that they're facing that challenge. But, with at least with global rise of unhappiness, that's not necessarily the case all over the world. So that theory kind of holds true, I think, for some of the change. But when you look at things like social media consumption and its impact on mental health,
Mm.
so many of the other things we know are changing in our society. It's not a surprise that that number's on the rise. And it also ties really to hybrid work. I mean, one of the number one reason people don't want to go to work every single day in an office is traffic and its impact on their well-being. So when you think about depression and anxiety and stress, all of these things now, like you're saying, become intimately tied into why these shifts are happening, and kind of tying it to one thing um, becomes very difficult, especially in terms of drawing out like causation.
There's a poll that comes out every year that's typically well covered, the world happiness numbers, right? And Finland likes to tout that they're the world's happiest country. Um, what do you make of those numbers? Or when you're saying general unhappiness, Finland might be the world's happiest country, and then there's number 2 and number 3. But generally speaking, everyone's number has slightly gone down. Are we grading on a curve, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the World Happiness Report that's all based on the World Poll, the same survey, the global survey we've been talking about. And yes, Scandinavian countries tend to rate higher on that metric. Now, the challenge is that survey really doesn't measure happiness. It measures life evaluation. It asks people basically
Hmm.
to answer 2 questions, and they're both the same: a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst life you can imagine living, 10 is the best. Rate your life today and rate where you think you'll be in 5 years. And based on people's numeric response to those 2 answers, they're placed into one of 3 categories. Thriving are people who rate their lives at 7 or 8, respectively, and higher. Suffering are people who rate their lives at 4 or low or below. So what we're looking at when we talk about global happiness is really that rate of thriving, that rate of people who are evaluating their lives at a 7 today and higher, 8 and higher for the future. Now, That's not the only way to measure life evaluation, and it's certainly not the only way to measure happiness. So what we find with those metrics, Mo, is they do tend to correlate very strongly with your financial situation. So
Mm.
surprise, surprise, Northern Europe GDP per capita is higher than a lot of the other countries.
Some of the richest countries in the
There you go.
world, including Norway, I think the richest. Yeah.
So that metric, it's very true, and it does follow that trend. Now, we also ask all these other questions with the global rise of unhappiness. So have you experienced a lot of stress, worry, anger? The positive and negative affect questions is what they're called in psychology. Those countries, the highest on those countries are very different. And the region actually that has the most positive and negative experiences is actually Latin America. And it's consistently been that way ever since we started the global poll. Actually, in terms of positive experiences, Latin Americans are always the top region, which some of us like to joke and say they have the most fun, or they're the happiest.
So they have the highest highs and the lowest lows in Latin America.
Exactly. They have the highest highs and the highest lows, if you will.
Okay.
So they're expressing that much. You mentioned Singapore. Singapore is a country that traditionally has the lowest on both. They don't have high negative or high positive.
They live at a 5.
If you ask about their emotions, but when you ask about the life evaluation, they fall much more in line with the GDP kind of like correlated metrics. So it just depends on what you mean by happiness. And it depends on, how you ask the question, not to sound like Edward Semi.
I just came back from Ethiopia, Mo, just a couple weeks ago, and was trying to interview people there, and was talking with my interpreter. And I was trying to get a sense from some of them about concern or worry. And they're like, culturally here among many people in Ethiopia, we don't like to express that we're worried about something. And I find that so fascinating because here in the US, like, we're more than happy talking about our concern, our worry.
Absolutely.
In fact, sometimes I think we overstate it, depending, and we'll get to that in a second. And so I just find that so interesting because, like, so how do you gauge in a country like Ethiopia or other places where culturally you're not supposed to express to somebody else that you're concerned about something, that you're supposed to be optimistic?
And that's exactly why, Mo, we don't just ask one question or ask about people's lives in one way, because we know that these nuances are absolutely true. I mean, that's even true really in the US. Like in some culture, I grew up in LA. In LA, it's totally okay to talk about how you feel and what's bothering you constantly. In other parts of the country, it's not really acceptable or it's looked down upon. It's just all of these cultural nuances determine how we answer these questions. And that's why we need to always be testing what the question's really doing with this population. And we do. So in Ethiopia, for example, are the folks who are, conducting surveys on the ground for us are local Ethiopians that understand that dynamic. One of the most fascinating ones for me, and Mo, I think I'm trying to get you to laugh here, is what I call the Alhamdulillah complex for people who are from the Arabic speaking world. So you ask people like, are you satisfied with your life? Saying no, in many of the cultures in the Middle East, it's kind of blasphemous to say I'm not satisfied with my life. Like, God is providing all these things for you. You need to show appreciation and thankfulness. It's a very traditional concept. So people say,
wait, translate Alhamdulillah.
All praise is due to God. So if you go to the Arabic speaking part of the world, you ask people like, how you doing? The right answer is Alhamdulillah. So you see a dude, he lost a shoe, he's on the ground, his knee's bleeding. How are you doing? Alhamdulillah. He has to, or else you're a complainer. So there's all this social pressure about saying, yes, I'm satisfied with my life. So when we were doing, and we still do, polling in Iraq, like at some of the worst, most dangerous times to be an Iraqi citizen, satisfaction rates were like not changing. And in our polls, we're like, what's going on, dude? Like, how is it possible that people in this environment can say they're satisfied with their lives?
Well, it's so interesting because one of the numbers that I took away from the World Happiness Index was out of Ukraine, where the numbers didn't shift over 2022 as the country went to war and was being invaded by Russia.
Yeah. And what was fascinating, I mentioned our polling in Afghanistan. Our polling in Ukraine this year was absolutely some of the most important work we've done. We're polling again. We're actually in the field now. Ukraine's fascinating because even though it's a war zone, it's connected enough to where you can reach people on cell phone really anywhere.
Right. I was going to say about 15% of the country is occupied by Russia. Right?
Absolutely. So you want to talk about an environment where you need to be careful about what you're asking people. And you also, of course, need to be careful about how you interpret the data, right? if I'm asking people on the front lines of a war how they feel about the leadership of the opposing country, that's going to be a complicated question to answer. But I can ask them about, like, how's it going? How have you been impacted? Has anyone in your family directly, like, lost their lives or been injured? Have you moved around since the war? So those are all things you could imagine are, pretty safe to answer in pretty
Yeah, just avoid the question of blame, right?
exactly.
Whose fault is it?
But one of the kind of general trends that we saw in those data that we got, and they were just around the time of the tail end of the last offensive by the Ukrainians. It was essentially a rally around the flag factor. Ukrainians were extremely positive on their leadership, through the roof on their military. They wanted to, we gave them option of, like, do you want to see the war end as soon as possible? Or do you want to you want the country to keep fighting to get back all territory? The further you moved away from the front line, the more people wanted the war to go on. So a lot of the data really reinforced what you would expect of a country that's, under attack, but holding up more than they and anybody in the world really thought they would. The data really reflected that. It'll be really critical to see this time to what degree that's been, worn down by the time that's passed with the war. It's also going to be really interesting to see when this counteroffensive starts and when our polling is going to coincide with that, because that'll absolutely be a factor. That's the other thing.
How do you account for all the displaced people? And, like, I mean, now you have a certain percentage of the population that no longer lives inside the country. Are you trying to poll the several million Ukrainians now who now live in Eastern Europe and around the world?
We're not. So we have our study is designed to be a household survey. So
Okay.
what we're trying to do is reach households and then find out, are you displaced as a household member? There are a lot of other approaches that organizations like us and others take to really quantify, like, who went where. One of the things, though, we do, Mo, is we ask every country in that region and then the world attitudes about migrants coming into the country. So sort of migrant acceptability attitudes. And what we found since the Ukrainian, influx of citizens into all of those neighboring countries is that migrant acceptance actually improved dramatically in many of those countries. So we would ask questions.
At least, so we're in the first year here, and you haven't seen any resentment built.
It's actually been the opposite, because some of those countries, I won't mention names, have actually some of the lowest scores on our migrant acceptance index. So it was a really good example. I know you're super familiar with the Syria diaspora situation. It was a great example of countries that have had a lot of migrants coming from a different part of the world not being so open to them. But then when it shifted to be Ukrainians, those attitudes really shifted.
So I'll leave the interpretation of why that is to other folks, though you can make certain assumptions. I want to head back here, though. You mentioned earlier trust in institutions being at a low, and I know this is something that Gallup has been looking at. It's certainly something that I'm hyper aware of in the media. In 2022, your number showed the highest percentage in 50 years reported no confidence at all in the news media. And by the way, as you were speaking earlier about, like, well, not all polls are the same. Polling's bad. I had the same feeling about the media. Not all the media is the same, but we tend to like to poll because, for simplicity, the media.
Absolutely.
Talk about the media, even though not all the media is built equally. Talk to me about these trust numbers when it comes to the news media.
Well, I just want to take a pause here and acknowledge the potentially hilarious situation. We are two guys from the Middle East that are going to start complaining about the media, and there's no more traditional, stereotypical. But that said, look, perceptions. There's no way to deny that trust in news in America has declined dramatically. I think the most dramatic long-term data point really is to take it back to Nixon. When Nixon was being impeached, 7 in 10 Americans said they had a great deal of confidence in the honesty of news in the country. Today, that 7 in 10 is closer to like a 38%. It's not even 4 in 10.
And we should say contextually, it came partially due, I mean, his downfall comes partially due to the media, right? The media discovers Watergate. You have the Washington Post reporting, Woodward and Bernstein, etc. And so that was a time where the media was uncovering the Pentagon Papers. There was a whole bunch of coverage of Vietnam, basically drawing skepticism, basically overturning things the government had been telling the population. And so there was this feeling among the populace, at least, that, oh, I could trust the media because the government's been lying to
Yeah,
me.
and they just took, just watch them take down the most powerful person in the world,
Right.
just simply by reporting, information that they got access to. So yeah, it was a really high point for them. But does that mean all is lost? No. I mean, a lot of other things that are happening with news consumption in the U.S. still leave room for hope. So are we, when it comes to mass media, are figures the same as they were in the 70s? No. But are people not consuming news? Absolutely not. They've just kind of shifted their behavior to following public figures more for news. And what's really interesting, we talk a lot about, these larger than life characters now in national news who are reporters, but also celebrities. And, I kind of follow the person, I don't follow the platform. What's really fascinating is that even though we know that 9 in 10 Americans say they follow a public figure to know what's going on in the world, a lot of times that public figure can be a comedian, they can be an artist, they can be an activist, not a journalist. But where they're going for those insights from those public figures are still the traditional platforms. So it's still TV, it's still, the online newspapers. So even though trust in media has shifted, behaviors around media consumption are adjusting to those attitudes. It's not like everyone is just completely plugging out and no longer interested in news. Quite the contrary, right? Speaking anecdotally, I mean, we're on a platform that is a great example of folks who saw trust in media really collapsing and tried to create a different space, a space that
Mhm.
really addressed those concerns. I was just talking this morning with the researcher who led all that work. We have a great update on those this morning on our website, and her thing was telling me, we've documented that trust in news has declined. This is Dr. Sarah Fiorani. But what actually builds trust in news? Why don't we study the activities like on Mo News and other platforms? Are these activities really building back trust in news? And what is it that they are doing that's helping with that? I know a lot of people feel like investigative journalism, media's got to get back to investigative journalism, and that's what's going to build back trust in news. But I think a lot of us have focused too long on the fact that trust has declined and not enough on what builds it back. It's also very unfair to talk about this outside of the context of this larger lack of confidence in institutions generally in America.
Right. I was going to say it comes at the same time, like I kind of track it to, and maybe, you can help me with the date here, but, to the WMD Iraq
Yeah,
thing, right? That suddenly
2003.
this was a case where the government put forward the theory that Saddam had nukes and was developing these weapons. We got to go to war in Iraq. This stuff was leaked to major media institutions. The New York Times went with it on the front page. The Washington Post went with it on the front page. Colin Powell's of the UN, etc. It turns out that there were no WMD, and over the course of the past 2 decades, you've seen this loss of trust in, whether it's the White House or the FBI or the CIA or the CDC and the FDA in the case of COVID, et cetera, and the media that and the Supreme Court is something we've been talking about too, especially in the wake of Roe v. Wade, among people who disagreed with that decision and the various things that have come out. It seems like no institution, at least in when we look at America, is immune from this loss of trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, the Iraq war, it's hard, it's hard not to acknowledge the role that played in people really putting, their trust in something and then discovering, oh, we should have asked more questions or we should have been more, deliberate.
Right. We spent trillions of dollars, 20 years, lives lost in America and Iraq. The whole country went into a war. It literally invaded and took over a country, and it turned out to be on false pretenses.
But again, Mo, then you'll be fascinated with this. It's not new. Every single conflict, America.
Well, I guess Vietnam is the same way. The Spanish-American War was the same way.
Well,
I mean, we could keep going
and
back,
just
right?
speaking from our data, really the Gallup data, like every conflict since World War II, with the exception of the first Persian Gulf War, every single one of those conflicts basically started off on the right side of public opinion. And by the time the war was ending, most people thought it was a mistake. So it's also what happened with the Iraq war was also part of a cycle that's been going on in the United States and with the news media. I think what made it different is the ability of non-established journalists and platforms to really start challenging that.
Right.
And raising really awareness into how much of a miss that was. It's hard to find somebody these days, that's not, unless it's for like ideological reasons. That's like, yeah, that was a great decision by the United States. Most Americans think it was a mistake. Most Americans actually, one of the tragic things is for the first time, as the U.S. was pulling out of Afghanistan and that disastrous withdrawal at Kabul, it was the first time most Americans also saw that war as a mistake. And that was
Right.
really, Afghanistan was the exception to that statistic I mentioned, because most Americans still thought it was worth, getting involved.
Right, because the premise there was that's where bin Laden was, that's where, 9/11 happened, and that we had a certain obligation to help the country and prevent something like that from happening in the future. It struck me recently, Mohammed, looking at your poll as Biden began his reelection, that he begins his reelection at the lowest point, effectively the lowest point in modern history, save for Ronald Reagan
Yeah.
in '83. And I think people forget this. Ronald Reagan began also in the high 30% approval rating. As he began his reelection, he would go on, of course, to dominate in the '84 campaign. And by the way, another parallel, had age concerns. Now, he was
Yeah.
younger, respectively, than Biden, but they both begin their reelection as the oldest president at that time, in the high 30% area. But looking at overall numbers, and again, having covered this for a couple decades now, just how partisan things are. There was a time not so long ago, post 9/11, as we
Yes.
bring that up again, where Bush could have, two-thirds, three-quarters of the country support
Oh,
him.
absolutely.
Um, and it feels like sort of after that, whether you're the Obama era, the Trump era, or the Biden era, there's nothing more than 50-50. Like,
At best.
you're on your
Yeah.
team, you fly the flag, you fly a blue flag or a red flag. And will we ever go back to an era of, where a president can gain two-thirds of the country's approval?
Yeah, and that's really, I love how you put your finger right on the issue. President Biden came into office with really one grand mission, which was sort of to unite the country, right? To get us beyond uh, COVID and the divide. And
Return us to those old
yes,
days when,
America's back. America's back,
yeah.
right? And really, that hasn't happened. I mean, when you look at the data, and you nailed it, it really wasn't Trump. It was Obama, Trump, and Biden are 3 terms now where presidential approval has increasingly become partisan in its divide. What does that mean? There are fewer and fewer and fewer people from the opposing side that will approve of the job the president is doing. So that margin is just getting worse and worse for the country. The other thing is the favorability ratings of both parties are not great. And the rate of people who are identifying as independents is at a relative high. It's at 40% right now. Now, of course, you have leaners, and when you really press people, they might give you a different answer. One of the things, Mo, I think that is really underreported on this point is that unlike just the general up and down of people identifying as independents, young people today are sticking with their independent identification longer than young people in previous generations. So if I am 18 to 25 or 18 to 30, compared to like 30 years ago, what we see is people tend to say they're independent when they're younger. And then as they get older, they kind of pick a side, if you will, or at least pick an identification. But young people are sticking more with that independent mindset or identification. It is also a relative high of people saying that they want a third party in the United
Right.
States. But of course, America's where all of us are famous for saying, do you want more? Yeah, I want more, but how do you get there is a lot more arduous than just kind of proposing a third party. But
Well, that's the big question I get. I mean, more and more people are like, I can't believe this election is shaping up to be Biden v. Trump again. The 2 oldest men to ever run for president. 2 men who more Americans don't favor
exactly.
than favor. And by the way, we saw that in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. So now we've gone through several cycles now where Americans,
the least popular people in public life are running for office. I mean, that's literally one way to look at it. When you talk about the favorability rating of Secretary Clinton or President Trump or President Biden, their favorability ratings are really, really in the dumps. I mean, very few people have a favorable view of them. Very few people in America have a favorable view of Washington. national government, we're talking about institutions of the past. One of the things that everyone knows is Americans are really down on national government. But what a lot of people don't know is that's not the case with local government. So Americans aren't like ready to burn the place down, really.
They just want to burn Washington.
Exactly. Because when you ask about corruption in local government, it's actually not a big problem. Corruption at the national level, majorities say corruption is widespread at the national level.
At least, sorry, this is the viewpoint of Americans. We're not sitting here, you and me, saying there's no corruption at a local level, but the perception of corruption.
It's relatively much lower than at the national level. So the question we ask is corruption widespread in government? We ask about Washington and then local government. We also ask about, the effectiveness of local government. Do you trust your governor, your mayor, et cetera, to make decisions that are fundamentally in the best interest of the public or fundamentally in their own personal interest? Those data are basically the inverse for what you find with Washington vis-a-vis local government. And again, it's not like local government's great and it's euphoria, but the idea that Americans are mad at their government or are ready to tear the place down, or like the Trump, Bernie Sanders kind of grievances getting loud, and that's populism is taking over. A lot of that really is a national dynamic, but the local dynamic is very, very different.
So we head now, as we speak, we have about 18 months till a general election in America. One of the joys of America is we have the longest elections in the Western world. And I'm curious as to, I know you guys are constantly polling economic indicators and happiness, etc. What are some of the numbers that everyone should be looking at to get a gauge? I mean, there's going to be the top line number. Are you going to vote for Biden or Trump? Are you going to vote for DeSantis or Trump? Whatever, fine. But what are some of the other numbers in terms of how people are living their lives or feeling about their lives that you feel are accurate indicators of where this election might be going?
Well, I mean, just to be specific with votes. So yeah, we're not going to be forecasting who's going to win this next matchup, but we are definitely going to ask people about the process, how they feel about the process. Do they trust the process? But my answer to your question is some of the most telling questions for me will be, how do you plan to vote and when do you plan to vote? Are you voting in the mail? Are you voting early?
Because that's become so partisan.
And it's completely changed after COVID. There was this explosion, of course, of people voting in another form than just walking up to their local high school or whatever and putting in a ballot. But those factors are really going to determine who is the likely voter, if you will, in that likely voter model for the people who will be forecasting the election.
Right. Actually, talk about that. So not all polls are equal. Not all people you poll are equal. There's Americans, there's registered voters, and then there's likely voters.
Yes. So, and they're defined differently by different organizations. Obviously, a general public poll is just Americans generally. You could also ask people if they are registered to vote. And then you can ask people, did they vote in the last election? And that's where it gets super helpful in figuring out who's actually likely to vote. But again, Mo, that was true in the 90s. I don't know if it's true today, right? America's really changing, and who votes is really changing. So a lot of the challenge with trying to get ahead of the election and figure out who's going to win is many of the presumptions we have made, or that the premises we bring into that analysis, are now changing. And is our forecasting taking into account those changes? Are our models taking into account that the likely voter of 2024 looks very different than the likely voter of 1994? Because that's going to be all the difference in your accuracy.
Well, we also saw record turnout in the last election, so it'll be interesting to see whether that continues. And when I say last, I mean the last presidential in 2020. One thing you told me about earlier, and I think this is probably the most popular question I get, Mo, and love you to explain, why should I trust a poll when I see that you have, like in the Biden approval level, you polled 1,013 adults, 1,000 people in a country of 350 million.
Absolutely.
And you were telling me before that 90-something% of people don't pick up the phone anymore. Why should we trust those numbers? How does that work?
Well, there are a few reasons why you should trust the numbers. First of all, those numbers are constantly being tested against real life outcomes to make sure they're actually capturing what we're measuring. So even though we're not forecasting an election, it doesn't mean we're not testing the accuracy of those metrics, whether it's using economic indicators, whether it's using election outcomes, all kinds of situations where you can test the accuracy of that. An incidence rate is gathered across a lot of different behaviors in society, and there's great data on a lot of them, and you can test that. So that's one factor. The 1,000, I thought you were going to say, like, isn't that too few people? And it is not a lot of people in 300 million. What's really important to keep in mind, though, is it's very similar to taking a blood sample. If you want to know how my body's doing, you don't necessarily need to take a huge amount of blood to test and figure out, like, what's going on with Mo's, white blood cell levels. You do need to accurately capture a sample. If you contaminate that sample, if you use a dirty needle, if the container you're putting the blood in already has stuff in it that's messing up the results, you're definitely going to get bad data. So actually, polling is not so much about volume. It's more about representativeness. If you capture the right sample, you can reach a very representative projection of what the entire population would think and say. And these things have been, tested rigorously over generations in the statistics field.
So
one of the things that's fascinating, Mo, is when you actually add more and more and more respondents, what the research shows is it doesn't make your data that much more accurate. It does, though, make it more useful in being able to look at more granular parts of society. So there are polls that we do at Gallup where we gather thousands and thousands and thousands of folks, whether it's workplace research that we do, or we want to understand the dynamics with the LGBTQ community and how identification is changing, et cetera.
Right. I was going to say, like, those smaller populations, like, for example, like 12% of America is Black, right?
Yeah.
So in that poll of 1,000 adults, did you make sure to ensure that 120 of them were
Yes.
Black?
Yeah.
And that 300 of them were Latino to capture the third of America that is
It's
that?
not that flat of a, like, apple to apple ratio, but yes, absolutely. That's exactly the concept, is that are the people I'm interviewing, do they look the same as the population I'm saying they represent? So if you're doing a national poll, everything you said is absolutely true. Is your sample really a representative sample for the population, or are you just interviewing people who are high income, white, with a corporate job, sitting, on their phone somewhere? The other challenge is, for example, there's a lot of online polling now. We have the largest panel in the U.S., and we do tons of online polling.
Right, that's become the standard now, online polling.
Well, it depends on standard for what, right? So the benefit.
Sorry, I was talking to the polling team at CBS.
Yes.
And like at CBS News, New York Times, for their poll, they're mainly doing it online.
And that's a huge transition that's taking place. So one of the advantages we have at Gallup is we really tackle this more as researchers than as ideologues. So as a researcher, you know that every tool, every methodology really has its pros and cons. And we choose the methodology that's most efficient and useful based on sort of, what we're after and what the objective of the study is. So we do tons of polling online. We tend to find that online polls in general are skewed more towards higher income, not as minority representative, and minorities that are in them tend to be more high income, higher educated. So what a lot
and when we say online polls, we're not talking about you just putting up like a poll on Facebook. We're talking about like there's a scientific,
absolutely,
like you're getting
this is
a
a
group
very
of people.
detailed thing where I email Mo and I say, hey, Mo, we are Gallup. We're doing this poll. Do you want to be in our panel and be polled repeatedly on issues throughout the year? And depending on what I'm trying to do, I could poll him once a week or I could poll him once a year. He can opt out. But yeah, it's very, very rigorous and scientific in its endeavor. It's not a survey like that pops up as an ad on while you're scrolling the internet.
So I want to end here with something you mentioned earlier, that you're looking to rejigger things a little bit to try to get more productive outcomes. It's not just about polling the lack of trust and how everything sucks, right? But because being more solutions oriented. And so I want to end there in terms of the types of questions you're asking, or how are you looking to approach that even beyond the trust vertical to get at potentially being a guidebook to policymakers or to companies or to nonprofits when it comes to, all right, we have some problems in this country or in this world. How do we go about solving them?
Yeah, I love that question. It's essentially like, how do you decide what to ask? And it's the hardest question we get. Like, you can ask anything. Why would you ask Americans about X? One of the ways we really approach it, Mo, is we try to speak to the people on the front lines of these issues. So stakeholder interviews and focus groups with the folks that really are trying to figure out, how do you reform the tax situation in America? Does the IRS really need to be reformed? What are the pain points of people in paying taxes? I just picked that, out of a hat, but really having a constant research agenda of having those conversations and making sure those are informing the questions we ask the public. The other thing is, the public doesn't have a lot of the answers on these challenges. But what they do is really have a great insight into how those challenges are impacting them at a local and granular level. So a lot of times policy conversations are at this 50,000 foot mark, where primarily it's consumed by the latest buzzword in the industry, trying to figure that out. I mean, quiet quitting is a great example. Suddenly quiet quitting was like everywhere. We've been polling on employee engagement for decades. And essentially it is quiet quitting. It's basically going to a job, doing the bare minimum, and not really seeing your future potential growth in that position. Is that an economic issue? Is that a social issue? It used to just be an HR issue. The way we started asking about it was working with HR executives 30, 40, 50 years ago and trying to figure out, what are the challenges you all are facing? So part of it is doing your homework, and just as a research organization, understanding that we're constantly being disrupted. AI is a great example. We're now in the process of figuring out, how do we set a series of questions about AI that can track how Americans or anyone feels about it 10, 20, 30 years from now. You can see how those questions are going to be very different than, like, what do you think about ChatGPT? Did you use it last week? Those questions aren't going to be useful in 20 years, but AI is probably still going to be with us and is still going to be disrupting society. So we'll talk to folks who are in that space, whether they're building these tools, whether they are training people in the workforce to use them, and how to navigate, that employment disruption in those industries. But without really going out and doing the work, you end up only asking questions that are going to get really clickable headlines. And then you find yourself back in the situation of, like, can we trust the polls? So if you're following an organization's polling that's really not doing that deeper research, mix it up a little bit and come check us out.
I was gonna say, asking those questions now I'm like wondering if who asked the question in the early '90s about, do you see a cell phone being useful?
Yep.
How do you see yourself using the internet? Do you think that'll be a
We
part of your
have
life?
It's so cool, but we
You
have
probably have that
all
data,
those
right?
data. I mean, I can literally come on here, like, in a few weeks, we'll go through all the old data. It's amazing. Like, do you think cell phones are going to be a thing? At what point did people realize that this is actually going to take over?
Mo, what's so interesting, one of the first stories I wrote for my college paper in 2000 at GW, the front page story, and we were going through this as we were moving recently. We found the front page story asking students on campus, are you going to get a cell phone this year? Like, it seems to be a thing now in the year 2000. And it's like, you look at it now, you're like, I can't even imagine that was a choice. And you see quotes from some students being like, oh, I don't need to be tracked like that. Like, they can just leave me a voicemail.
Yeah.
It was 20 years ago.
Yep. And it's like, and at what point do we fold, right? Because we still know that that's true, right? They are tracked. Whatever. Like, we are being tracked. You're definitely giving up your privacy, and people identified that so long ago, but something shifted and suddenly everybody was okay with that.
So much more to talk about. I look forward to having you back. Thank you for, I think you messaged me on Twitter. It's one of the more useful things that I've experienced on Twitter in the past couple of months was you reaching out. So I'm glad we connected.
Awesome.
This has been a fascinating conversation. There's no shortage of interest in polls. And so I appreciate you coming on. Mo, before we go, how do people track what you guys are doing?
You can come to news.gallup.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter front page, or you can listen in to our podcast, the Gallup Podcast.
Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks for having us.